Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this afternoon. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions, and today I will be presenting on mastering your qualitative methodology. Just before we get started, a few things about Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation editing and consulting company. And what that means is that we provide assistance and support to doctoral students like yourselves during all stages of the dissertation process. So from the beginning, topic development all the way through to the end of the dissertation, so the final defense and everything in between, we have staff that assist with all of those different elements. We do help with both qualitative and quantitative studies, as well as mixed methods. So if you are exploring the different types of studies that you might want to work on, and you think that you may benefit from assistance, we do have people on staff that can help with each of those different types of research methods. During the presentation today, I will be going over the different components of the qualitative methodology chapter listed here on this slide. And then at the end, we will take some question and answers. So feel free as we go through to post questions in the chat if you have any, and then I'll be sure to get to those at the end. We also have someone from our team on the call who will be working the chat in the background. So you may have noticed that there are some links in the chat already. Those are some resources from our website that may be helpful to you as you work on your dissertation. And then as an attendee today, you will receive a copy of the webinar within the next 24 to 48 hours, as well as the slide deck. So if you're coming in late, don't worry about that at all. We've got you covered. But we can go ahead and get started. So today's presentation, again, is going to be on the qualitative methodology chapter. Generally, the components that go into that chapter are the introduction, research design and rationale, the role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and then also the summary. This is a pretty comprehensive list of what you should be including in this chapter, but we always recommend to students before you get started writing your dissertation or any of the chapters, make sure to check in with your reviewer, your committee, your chair to see if there's any template or specific guidelines that they want you to follow. Every school is a little bit different. Again, this list is comprehensive, but some schools may require, an extra element here or there. So I just recommend always checking in with them to make sure you're including what is needed and not doing any extra work on your end. But during the presentation today, I will go through each of these sections a little bit more specifically to talk about what is needed to cover each of these elements here. So in your introduction, you will want to restate the purpose of your study, and you will want to do that verbatim. So you can literally copy and paste the purpose of the study that you outlined in your introduction chapter into the introduction of your methods and anywhere else where you are restating the purpose. This is not the place to start changing things and getting creative. It may start to feel very redundant or repetitive to use the same phrasing, but it's important in order to maintain the meaning and the consistency of the purpose that you just go ahead and copy and paste that purpose anywhere that you are reminding the reader of it. You'll also want to preview what is upcoming in the chapter. So each of the major sections, what do you intend to talk about? So here you can list out those different sections that I've outlined on that first slide. So role of the researcher, trustworthiness, research design and rationale. That's kind of giving the reader a preview of what you're going to be talking about in this chapter. And then in your research design, you will want to restate the research questions here very clearly. Again, you'll want to do this verbatim. So you'll want to just copy and paste those research questions as you've already outlined them into this section. for the same reason. So you just want to make sure that the reader has a clear and consistent picture of what the purpose and the research questions are that are guiding your study. So you'll just want to make sure that those are restated in the same way that you've already defined them before. And then you will want to identify the concepts that you're studying. So maybe you're doing a case study and you're defining the case or the cases, or maybe you're doing a phenomenological study and you're going to define the phenomenon that you're studying. So for example, if you're conducting a study where you want to understand the lived experiences of maybe pregnant women in a specific geographic area, the phenomenon under study there would be pregnancy. So you'll want to identify what that phenomenon is. Next, you will want to talk about the tradition that you're going to be using. So here is where you will want to differentiate between qualitative or a quantitative design. Since you're all here in this presentation, I'm assuming that you are intending to do a qualitative study because this is the qualitative methods webinar. So here you'll want to identify what it means to do qualitative research and why it makes sense for you to use that for your particular research study. And then you'll want to justify why the qualitative approach is most appropriate. So I like to think of this as using a few high-level paragraphs outlining why a researcher would use a qualitative study. So you might say what qualitative studies are good for, and then moving on to do the same thing for quantitative studies, and then possibly moving on and also doing that for mixed methods. So you're not just identifying the particular tradition that you're using, but you're explaining the different types of traditions because you want to show the reader that you understand what alternative traditions are used for, and that's how you were able to select the qualitative method for your study. So you're just demonstrating that you understand all of the options that are available to you, and that informed your particular research method and design. Next, you will want to do the same thing, but this time for the particular research design. So first you identified the type of research method you're using, in this case, qualitative. Now you're going to talk about the different designs within the qualitative method and identify and justify why it's most appropriate for your particular study. So that could look like talking about the different applications of a case study, of a phenomenological study, and of a grounded theory study. And then using the problem and purpose and research questions that you've already outlined, identify for the reader how the specific research design that you've selected aligns with those problem, purpose, and research questions. So for example, again, going with this phenomenological research example, if you are wanting to study the lived experiences of individuals, it would make sense to go forward with phenomenology. So here, when you're describing the different types of research designs, you can highlight the utility of that and align it with your particular study. You might also then describe what a case study is used for, and in that same way, you can highlight that it is not getting at what you're hoping to study. So in order to do the things that I've outlined on that slide, first you'll need to understand exactly why you would use a qualitative study. So let's go ahead and get into that a little bit. Oftentimes, our research questions might be along the lines of trying to understand participants' perspectives on something, or their experiences, or their lived experiences, and how they're making meaning of those experiences. That would be a typical purpose or objective of a qualitative study. So to really get at, those types of concepts of experiences or opinions or perspectives, the data that you would collect would probably be through interviews or focus groups, maybe some document analysis, or even observations. So those data collections all have one thing in common, and that is that they yield textual data, so words. So when you think of a qualitative study, you should generally think of words. So if it makes sense for you to use an approach where the data that you collect is words as opposed to numbers, then that is a good indicator that you should use a qualitative study instead of a quantitative study. The goal of qualitative studies, unlike in quantitative studies, is not necessarily to generalize the findings, right? So when we think about a quantitative study, we're thinking of large sample size, how applicable are these findings to populations outside of our sample. Qualitative studies differ in that the sample size is relatively smaller for a qualitative study. Generally, you're looking for a sample size that will achieve data saturation. So we want to interview just enough people to where there aren't any new themes emerging, but we're not necessarily looking for a sample size of 300. And similarly, in a qualitative study, you wouldn't necessarily say, okay, the experiences of these 15 people that I've interviewed is generalizable to all pregnant women in this local area, that I studied. So in this case, you're really just trying to understand the experiences of those particular participants and trying to speak on that particular phenomenon or experience, but you're not necessarily looking to generalize it out. So that's one difference between the quantitative and qualitative. Another one is that there's no hypothesis testing. So in this case, you are not going to be developing any hypotheses because it is a qualitative study. So that's another difference. And then also there's no need to quantify results in a qualitative study. So you aren't going to be saying 6 out of 7 participants described X. Here you're just looking at the quality of the data. So we're not looking to say to show frequencies of a particular experience, but really just trying to understand whatever that experience is. And then in terms of particular research designs, this is not an exhaustive list of qualitative research designs. There are many, but this is a list of what I've seen students use most often with their dissertations. So I will give a high-level summary of what each of these is used for, and then we can kind of take some questions on it at the end here. So the few that I'll go over today are case study, phenomenology, generic qualitative designs, grounded theory, and ethnography. So starting off with case studies, these are really helpful when you are wanting to look at a specific example of something, perhaps over time. So a case study is a really in-depth analysis of a particular case, or if you're doing a multiple case study, then particular cases. So I like to think of this as taking a really deep dive into something and looking at it from all angles. So you're getting a really holistic look of whatever that case or cases is. If you're doing a multiple case study, then you most likely have more than one case. And one thing to make note of is that they should be bounded by something that's uniting them. So something like a common thread. So if you are maybe studying teachers in a particular school district, the uniting thread could be the school district that they work in. So just thinking about whatever you're going to use to kind of bound these case studies together if you are doing a multiple case study. In terms of the type of data collection methods that are used for case studies, there are typically multiple data collection methods that are used. So it probably wouldn't just be one qualitative interview. You might also pull in some document analysis, or you might conduct observations of your participants. And that's really a hallmark of a case study, is just using multiple data collection methods. in order to get that very holistic 360-degree view of whatever it is that you're studying. And then in terms of outcomes for case studies, so what is the purpose or what is it there to do? That's generally there to generate a really rich description of the case. And you can use something like thematic analysis to analyze the data once you've collected it to identify any themes or patterns that emerge from the study of the case or the cases. Next, phenomenology. This one is a little bit different from a case study because it has philosophical underpinnings and is deeply rooted in psychology. This has to do with lived experiences and making meaning. So if you're exploring how people make sense of their lived experiences, then this is probably the study for you. So again, high level overview here. But do be aware that there are different approaches to phenomenology that are out there. Generally, these studies make use of in-depth interviews. We rarely see other forms of data collection included in these types of studies. And when I say in-depth, I mean that it could be hours spent with the participant or even multiple interviews over time. So it could be that you meet with the participant once and then after that initial interview, you have another follow-up interview with them. And the outcome of these types of studies is really a rich description of whatever the essence of the experience is. So the phenomenon here. And what you're looking for are the common themes that are occurring across participants. So in terms of data analysis for this type of study, thematic analysis is another common method used to analyze any interview data that you collect in this type of study. Now, generic qualitative designs are very helpful when your study doesn't fit nicely within kind of the framework of a phenomenological study or another study. So I'm going to talk about two more after this. So if it doesn't fit in grounded theory or in an ethnographic study. Sometimes these are called descriptive qualitative studies or general qualitative studies. There's research and there's literature that you'll find using both of the terminology, but generally the generic case study does not, or I'm sorry, the generic study does not mean that it's like less rigorous or less applicable. I think sometimes there's a bit of a stigma attached to it, even though there's plenty of literature to support the use of specifically generic qualitative design. So if you're less concerned with how people make sense of an experience and you're more concerned with the experience itself, so the focus is more outward and not the psychology or that inward experience, then a generic or generalized approach might be more useful for you. So for example, if you are looking to study maybe violence in schools from the perspective of teachers, but you're not really concerned with what teachers think about that violence. You're really just wanting a description of how that manifests, maybe what strategies are used to mitigate it, and really taking out that like emotional piece of how are they interpreting that, then this might be a good study for you. For this type of study, the data collection is generally pretty fluid. So you can use interviews, questionnaires, surveys, documents, observations, really whatever data collection technique that you need to address your research question. And that's kind of one of the benefits of the generic qualitative design is that it's very flexible. And then I've provided this citation here. So again, you will receive a copy of the slides. If you are struggling to provide rationale with your chair for why this study might be helpful or might be appropriate for what you want to do, this citation is a very helpful resource in really just laying out the merits of the generic qualitative design. But generally what this does is it just yields understanding of outer world content related to your research question. And again, it's a pretty flexible design. The next one I'm going to go over is grounded theory. This is one that I do not see a whole lot of students taking on. This is a very sociological in nature. It's used in the social sciences, but grounded theory is a bit different because rather than working from a theoretical framework and research questions, you would be going the opposite direction. So the idea here is that there's not a lot of literature or knowledge about a particular topic. And so through data collection and maybe field work or memoing, interviewing, participant observations, all of those different data collection methods, you would learn more about the topic and refine your ideas and your research questions. So you're moving in the opposite direction. Rather than your study being guided by the theoretical framework and research questions, your research questions are guided by your interpretation of the data that you've collected. And in this case, you would not need a theoretical framework because the outcome of grounded theory is that you're going to be developing your own theory. So this is an iterative process, and it kind of just starts in that different place, right? So your data is guiding the development of your research aims. Because of that, it's not always the best for novice researchers. It's also both time consuming, and then of course, if you are spending a lot of time on something during your dissertation, that could have implications for how long you are in the program. So it can be financially consuming as well if you're, signing up for extra semesters to continue data collection or develop that theoretical framework. The outcome of this type of study is that you will develop a theory rooted in your data. So you will develop an explanation of whatever's going on, whatever the concept, process, action, or interaction is that you develop from the theory based on what you're seeing in your data. And then the last design I'll talk about today is ethnography. This is another one that I don't see too much of with students in their PhDs. This study design is really anthropological in nature and also has some roots in sociology. This makes use of extended time in the field. So you'll be doing participant observations for your data collection here, and then also any interviews or other methods that you might need, like document reviews. But generally, this involves a lot of one-on-one observation of participants. And because of that, it also can be rather time consuming and also resource consuming. But this is a very helpful design when you are trying to understand the cultural or societal context of a problem. So this is holistic in nature, similar to some of the others that we've talked about today. And what the researcher will do here is that they will look at networks of people or, groups or institutions to understand all of the circumstances surrounding whatever the research problem is. So the outcome of this is an in-depth account of whatever that problem is from the perspective of the participants, but also the researcher has sort of an insider and outsider perspective, kind of being in that cultural situation, but then also being able to place the results within the larger cultural context. So the process of this is called ethnography, and then the outcome, the written product, is also called ethnography. So in your methods chapter, once you've identified your research method and design, so maybe you selected qualitative and you decided to do a phenomenological study, the next thing you'll want to do is talk about what your role as the researcher is. So you will have different roles in your research. And here is where you're going to describe that. So if you are conducting grounded theory or an ethnographic study, your role is probably as a participant observer, where you're both observing people as well as participating in activities of daily life. But that might not be the case if you are doing a different study where you are simply an observer. So if you're simply an observer, that may mean that you are interviewing participants, or if you're really lucky, you might have research assistants at your disposal that are interviewing participants for you. So whatever that looks like for your study, if you are working solo, you're doing all of your recruitment, data collection, and data analysis by yourself, you'll want to describe that here. If you're working with a team, you'll also want to outline what that looks like here. And the reason for this is because as researchers, we all impact our research no matter what. We may bring in different biases. So here you just want to be really clear and show the reader the ways in which you are engaged in your research, because that will help identify and set the stage for any potential biases that you describe later on in your results section. So in doing that, you'll want to identify any potential conflicts of interest or any biases that you might bring to your research. So one example of this could be if you are conducting research at your place of employment. So maybe you are a teacher and you are interviewing school administrators about a particular thing going on in the school. In that case, you'll want to identify that because there could be different power differentials between you and other participants. There could be some factors going on that may have implications for the type of responses you get. And so that will be important for your reader to know when they're interpreting your results later on in the process. And then you'll also want to identify the ways that you plan on mitigating any potential biases. So going along with that example of working in an environment where maybe you know the participants, or maybe you are interviewing them at their place of business, one way that you might mitigate that bias is by ensuring that through the informed consent process, participants are very clearly made aware that the study is confidential and voluntary. So nobody feels like they need to they need to be involved, or there might be repercussions for not being involved in your study. And also they know that the information that you collect in the study will not be shared. It may be de-identified. They will not be linked to the findings in any way so that they can feel like they can speak freely. So just thinking through, what potential conflicts might exist, and then how am I going to deal with those conflicts? That is what you'll want to do here. And then if there's any additional ethical issues that you think could arise, you'll also want to describe those and how you plan to mitigate those as well. So the really big ones are, any type of power differentials, if you are conducting data collection at the place you work. Also, if you're working with a population who maybe a sensitive population, so maybe children, individuals who may have some sort of mental illness, you will want to talk about any ethical issues that may be associated with that. And this will be helpful for you as you go into the IRB as well, because there will be implications in your IRB for all of those different ethical considerations too. Next, in the methodology section, this is, I would say, the meat of the chapter. This is where you really want to start to get specific and provide kind of step-by-step instructions of how you're going to conduct your study. So I always say that when you start this section, it's easiest to start off with bullets and then build the narrative around it. So the first thing you'll want to talk about is the population that your sample will be drawn from. So just a brief reminder, the population is the larger sample. So if I want to conduct a study of pregnant women in Florida and ask them about their experiences giving birth in Florida hospitals or something like that, the population for my study is pregnant women in Florida, but the sample for my study is going to be the maybe 15 to 20 pregnant women who actually participate in the study. So, you know, you're probably not going to be able to interview every person in your population, and that's why we have the sample. So maybe I can access those women at my local hospital or my local, you know, clinic, whatever it may be. So you will want to describe that population. You may first identify the population and then provide any descriptive statistics that you can get from either literature or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, depending on what you're studying, of what that population looks like. So how many people are in that population, and then any relevant demographic statistics that make sense. So if you are doing a study of teachers, it might make sense to understand what the highest level of education generally is among teachers, or the age. Maybe you'll want to provide a breakdown of the age, the race, and gender. So those might be some demographic characteristics that you include depending on what your population is. Next, you will want to talk about your sampling strategy. So because you are doing a qualitative study, typically you will use some type of purposive sampling. And what that means is there are specific criteria that people need to meet to be in your study. So back to my example, if I want to study pregnant women in Florida, the pre-established sampling criteria is that they're going to need to be pregnant and live in Florida. So those are two characteristics that I know all of my participants need to meet. And for that reason, this isn't like a random sample where I'm going to be just standing in the hospital and every third person asking them to participate in the study. I'm specifically looking for those very specific characteristics, right? So that's why I would use a purposive sampling strategy. Next, you'll want to describe your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this is a little bit different from the purposive sampling strategy. Now I'm outlining, in addition to those two criteria, what are the characteristics that people need to meet to be in my study. So it could be that I want to study women who are over the age of 18. Maybe I want to study women who are giving birth for the first time. Whatever that is for whatever that looks like for your study, you'll want to describe it here, whatever, you know, the characteristics are that they need to absolutely meet. And then if there's any exclusion criteria, you'll want to talk about that as well. Next, you'll want to talk about how you plan to verify this criteria. So if you are doing a study where there's a particular age limit, or maybe you're doing a study where you want people to have worked in a particular role during for a certain amount of time, like maybe you should have been a teacher for at least 3 years to participate in this study. How are you going to find out from participants whether or not they meet that criteria? One way you might do it is by distributing a survey via email through like SurveyMonkey or something, where the first few questions are just screening questions to ensure that people are meeting that criteria. And then from that pool, you can decide who's in and who's out. So whatever method you intend to use to verify that, you'll want to make sure you outline that here as well. And then the next few things you'll do are describe the number of participants that you intend to include. And the way that you'll do that is through your literature search. So each study design has different recommendations or different literature to support various sample sizes. So, and that largely relates to the data saturation and when themes typically stop emerging. So you can refer to your literature to identify a few examples or some rationale for why you're leaning towards a particular sample size. And then you'll just describe your intentions here. So in this study, I intend to recruit 15 participants. And then you'll provide a citation for why 15 is what you need for this study. The next part, this part, I feel like always gets glazed over because it seems very matter of fact to researchers, But remember, here in the method section, we want this to be so detailed that somebody can repeat everything that you did and conduct the study again. So you'll want to clearly outline the steps to identify, contact, and recruit participants. So let's say for identifying participants, maybe the way that you did that is you simply put a flyer in your local, again, with my example of pregnant women, maybe you put a flyer at your local hospital and you put your contact information on that flyer and said, you know, these are the inclusion criteria. Please contact me if you're interested. Then maybe the process looks like participants contact you and then you respond to them with the screening survey to see if they meet the criteria for your study. Once participants complete that survey, then you reach out to them to schedule a time for the interview. So all of those steps, it seems intuitive, but you'll just want to make sure to make it very clear in this method section so that your reviewer knows exactly what you're doing to recruit participants. And then lastly, you'll want to talk about sample size and data saturation. So I talked about that a little bit already, but here again is where you're just providing that rationale for the specific sample size that you are aiming for. And then also any contingency plans that you have in place if you aren't able to reach that sample size. So let's say you do your first round of recruitment and your intended sample size was 12, but you're only able to recruit 8 participants. You know, what steps are you going to take to really go out and get those last few participants? Do you need them? What are the implications for data saturation? So those are a few things you'll want to think about here as well. Next, you will talk about instrumentation. So you've already identified the type of study, the type of design you're using, and then who you intend to study. Now you're going to talk about how you're going to study them. So depending on the design that you've used, you may be using qualitative interviews, you may be doing a document review, you may be observing participants. Whatever instrument or method you're going to use, you just want to talk about that instrument that's been developed. So here's where you'll outline the interview protocol if you're doing a qualitative interview, or again, whatever technique you're using. For this section, I would use subheadings per instrument if you do have multiple data collection instruments. So you might start off talking about the interview, then go into the document review, just so that it's clearly sectioned off so that it's not getting muddled. If you are using something that's already been published, so if you're using maybe an interview guide that's already out there, it's been used in previous studies, that is perfectly fine as long as you have permission to do that. But if you do that, you'll just want to state that here and provide citations for where it's been used in the past. Typically, what I see for qualitative studies is that students will develop their own interview guides. So that's another option that you have available to you as well. And then if you are conducting any type of document review, you will want to identify how you are ensuring the accuracy of those documents. So an example of that might be if you are looking at medical records, for example, you will just want to identify how you know that those medical records are really true medical records and not just a random document that, you know, someone may have given you. So you'll just want to describe the process for how that's verified. And that could be, you know, kind of referring to the chain that it was given to you through. So maybe you got it directly from a hospital administrator, or maybe you're using a publicly available document. So here you'll reference where you access the document. So whatever that looks like for you, just how are you verifying the source of the document? And then lastly, you'll want to talk about how these data sources that you are using are sufficient to address the research question. So just thinking through the particular questions that you've outlined in your study, really going through the questions in your interview guide and making sure that they actually relate to the study. I think a lot of times when we sit down to create interview guides, there's so many questions that we want to ask participants, and it's okay to ask things that are outside of the scope, but just here, make sure to highlight exactly what in your interview protocol or your document review or whatever it is aligns with your research questions. So if you have 3 research questions, make sure that there's a particular data source aligned to each one. Now, that doesn't mean that it needs to be a different data source. It just means that if you have 10 interview questions and maybe 3 research questions that you've laid out for your study, identify which of those 10 interview questions or which combination of them is meant to answer the particular research questions. So maybe interview questions 1, 3, and 5 get at the concept that you need for research question 1, and so on. So just really aligning those data sources to the research questions. And sometimes I see students use a table to do this. I think that's a really helpful way to do it, especially just conceptualizing it in your head. Okay, I'm asking this question, but why am I asking it? Oh, it's because I want to answer research question 2. So that can be a helpful tool as well. And then just continuing on with the exact steps that you're going to be using. So for each instrument that you do outline, so for the purposes of this slide, I'm just going to talk about qualitative interviews. So for the qualitative interview, you will want to identify the who, the what, the where, the when. So where will the data be collected? Are you going to be conducting your interviews in person? If you're doing them in person, are they going to be at the library? Are they going to be at the person's place of business? Whatever that is, you'll want to describe. And then if you're not doing them in person, are you doing them over Zoom? Are you doing them over the phone? Again, just detailing the modality of the place where the data is collected. Next, who is going to collect the data? So getting back to that role of the researcher, are you going to be collecting the data yourself? Do you have a research assistant doing it? Is there going to be a combination where you have maybe you do some, your research assistant do some? Just describing that process. And then the data collection events, particularly if you have multiple data collection methods. What's the timeline to accomplish these things? So are you starting off with a document review and then maybe a week later going into an interview and then another week later doing some observations? Just outlining that timeline for your reader is going to be important. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the duration of the data collection. So typically when you talk about your instrumentation, you will describe how long it will take. So you might say, this study was guided by the following research questions. To answer those research questions, the researcher developed an interview guide that will take about 60 minutes. So just letting the reader know how long and how much time are you spending with participants. And then in terms of recording the data, this is a really important step. So with the qualitative study, it's not like a quantitative study where you're going to have like the responses from participants all laid out on a piece of paper, right? This isn't a survey where you can just grab the sheet and you have your data. You need to take some steps to make sure you're recording it. So that means that depending on what you have available to you, you might just take notes, right? You might just write out the responses that participants gave. I don't generally recommend that because it is not necessarily the best standalone method. Notes are great, but they should be accompanied when possible with a recording. So you'll want to, if possible, audio record or video record your interviews and then have them transcribed. There are some free transcription tools that most students have access to. So if you have Zoom through your school, Zoom has a transcription feature that you can use. I will say that transcripts from Zoom typically require a good amount of cleanup. So if you intend on using a Zoom transcript, I would just make sure to budget your time so that you have time to go through and really compare the transcript to the recording. Sometimes I find that when I record things on Zoom, if I take a breath, or if I say or something like that, the transcript will break up the lines. So you'll just, if you're going to use Zoom transcription, just make sure you're aware of some of those things and that you're going back and cleaning up the transcript before you analyze the data. Another common tool I see students use is Otter Ai. So you can record and get a transcription from Otter Ai as well. And then if you have it in your budget or if it's available to you, there's also various places where you can send recordings off for transcription. But all of that to say, you just want to make sure to think about those details and outline them here in this chapter 3 so that the reader knows, so that there's no gaps between when the data is collected to when it's analyzed. We really know, how it's being prepared. And then you'll want to talk about those contingency plans that you have in case of any issues with attrition. So again, if you're only able to recruit those 8 participants, what are the steps that you're going to take, or what is the plan in place that you have to get to the sample size that you intended on? And then another thing to think about is any potential follow-up procedures. So typically when we think about the trustworthiness of our data, we might use different tactics to make sure that we're accurately representing participant responses. So you could use something like member checking, where you are having participants look over the data that you've collected, or transcript verification, where you are actually providing participants with the transcript and having them okay it or say, yes, this accurately portrays what I feel that I was saying. So with those follow-up procedures, you'll just want to make sure to note whether or not you're going to be doing them. And then if you aren't able to accomplish it with a particular participant, so let's say you interview someone on Monday, you reach out to them with their transcript on Wednesday and they kind of fall off the face of the earth, you'll just want to talk about, what is the plan for those cases where you're not able to complete the follow-up procedure, and how do you intend on moving forward? All right, so once you've done all of that, you've recruited your participants, you've collected your data, it's finally time to analyze the data. So this is where you are going to get into your data analysis plan. There's a number of ways to analyze data. One that I typically see students use is thematic analysis. That can be applied to interviews, observations, and also document data. So here you'll want to talk about how the data are connected to the research questions, and then any coding procedures that you're planning to use for your data. So if you're using thematic analysis, you'll want to talk about the 6-step process that's included in thematic analysis, all the way from just having that transcript, that blank transcript that you haven't marked up yet, through to developing codes, and then themes, categories, and then themes. And that's how you identify any emerging themes in your data. In terms of doing this, I typically see students using software. So you might use something like NVivo, Deduce, maybe MaxQDA. And those are just very helpful to organize the different codes. So if you aren't familiar with those softwares, essentially what you do is you have your transcript in a Microsoft Word file, you upload it to the software, and then you read your transcript line by line, and you'll highlight any statements that you feel are similar. So for example, if you are doing that study of pregnant women in Florida and you want to know about their birthing experience, you may see that a lot of women will mention their epidural. So you would highlight statements related to their epidural, and you would create a brief description of a code for that statement. So in that case, I would say maybe the code would be epidural. You would go through and you would do that for everything that you feel is similar. So you would generate some sort of code book. The number of codes varies based on how much data you've collected, but essentially at the end of that process, you would have a code book. Then from there, you would look at your code book and you would determine which codes are similar. So maybe epidural shows up a lot, and then maybe another type of medication or another type of pain management. So you might say, okay, The epidural code and the pain medication or pain management code seem to be very similar. Let's consolidate these codes into a category. And then that category might be pain management during labor. And you'll do this for all of your codes. Then once you do that, you will go through again, and this time identify themes. So you might say, okay, participants are talking about pain management during labor in the same context that they're talking about something else. And you'll kind of develop use the literature to inform what does that mean? So pain management during labor and maybe, I don't know, something related to the doctor, whatever that theme might be, maybe the relationship that they had with the doctor or the way that the doctor cared for them in the hospital. So this is how you'll go through and develop codes. So here you will describe the process and you will talk about the software that you used. Now, if you don't intend to use software, that is totally okay as well, depending on, of course, your chair and what they'll approve. But other ways that you might analyze data without software are you could use an Excel file. So you could just kind of have your transcript data in the rows and then develop codes across the columns and then put like X's across areas where you think that the participant has described a particular experience to show that the code is there. Or you could, of course, just paper and pen analyze your data. So you could print out all your transcripts and then use different color highlighters to code the data. So there are a few options available to you. We do have a blog post about this on our website. But in addition to describing the process, you will also want to describe how you're going to handle any discrepant cases. So typically in qualitative studies, if you have, well, first of all, typically you will have at least one participant who doesn't conform to all of the ideas of the other participants. And that's not strange. That's very common, right? All people are different. So if one person has a completely different experience from your other participants, that's okay. So putting this into like a real world example, if you are studying teacher perceptions about the availability of professional development in their school, you might have 8 teachers say that they had a great experience, they had access to courses and, they had a really good experience. And then you might have one say that they felt like there were no resources available to them. That one experience is still important to note in your study because that, it may get at a larger theme. So you will want to talk about that particular discrepant case. We don't want to get rid of outliers in this case. So here you're just going to talk about how you're going to handle those discrepant cases. And then lastly, for trustworthiness, this is where you will describe the credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability of your research. So you will want to talk about how you are establishing each of these elements and ensuring that this is a study that is trustworthy. So how can the reader be confident in the accuracy of your findings? Typically, what I recommend is to look through the literature for each of these elements and see ways that other people have done it in the past. So one way that you may establish credibility is through triangulating your data. So if you are doing a case study, you might be able to triangulate the interviews with your document review. One thing to note, triangulation does not mean that you need 3 data sources. So 2 data sources is perfectly fine. And it's just showing that you can verify the findings through another data source. So that might be one method that you use. And then in terms of transferability, you will want to describe whether or not the findings are applicable to other contexts. So one study that I worked on was related to homelessness in California. So that's a particular study where the experiences that women had that brought them into homelessness, that may have implications or may be things that other people experience. So like loss of employment or having your home foreclosed on, like those are things that we can expect that other individuals may experience a similar outcome if they go through any of those types of themes that we identified in the analysis. And then for dependability, here you'll want to talk about the consistency of the findings. So some ways that you can ensure the consistency are by doing things like having an audit trail or a journal. So when you are coding, how are you making sure that you are coding consistently across all participants? I think having that journal or that really detailed code book where you have clear criteria for yourself on exactly what each code means is a really helpful way to check yourself, especially when you have a lot of data. You may get to a point where you're reading and you're like, I literally don't know what this statement means. I don't know how to classify this. And just having that code book to look back at and remember, the different inclusion and exclusion criteria for particular codes can be helpful. So an example of this, I worked on a paper where we had two codes. One was state-specific concerns and another was hospital-specific concerns. And a lot of times we ended up double coding. So we were kind of, everything that we coded as hospital specific ended up being also state specific. So we had to develop inclusion and exclusion criteria for that code so that we were being consistent. So it ended up being, if they mentioned the hospital, then we will only code hospital specific. And then if they mention the state, we'll only code state specific. So whatever that looks like for you, just making sure that you're keeping things in the same domain. Another example of another study, we were looking at barriers that HIV test counselors have in referring clients out for HIV prevention medication. And one barrier was time. And we were looking at both costs and barriers. So we noticed in our research team, some people were coding time as a cost, whereas some people were coding time as a barrier. So things like that, you just want to make sure that you're aligning all of the elements so that when you go back to look at the data that you've analyzed, you're kind of comparing apples to apples. So you're not having, this mishmash of time being reflected in various codes, but rather across one particular code so that you can really look at it in its entirety. And then confirmability. So we talked about this a little bit. In order to confirm that you are really basing the findings on what participants are saying and not kind of bringing in your own biases, you can use member checking or transcript verification to have the researcher, to have the participant look over the data that you've collected and kind of okay it to make sure that it's kind of coming from them. So these are generally the things that you'll want to go through, and you will just want to describe how you intend to establish that trustworthiness. So you can use any of the strategies that I've mentioned, or you can dig deep into the literature and see if there's any additional strategies that other researchers have used in the past. And then lastly, you'll go through the ethical procedures. So you will most likely need to submit your study for IRB approval. So a lot of what you put in chapter 3 is going to help with that. You'll want to talk about the agreements that you have had to gain to access participants or data. So if you are collecting data from a specific group, like if you are collecting data from teachers at your local high school, you may need to request permission from the principal or the superintendent to collect data at that location. So you will want to ensure that you have that that permission clearly and that you're outlining that for both your IRB and for the ethical procedures here. Then you'll also want to think about how are you making sure to consider ethics in your recruitment and data collection. So one important thing is that informed consent form. So participants should understand that their participation in your study is voluntary. You should also make sure they know what the study is about, what you intend to do with the data that you collect, and also any potential risks that they can experience as a result of participating. So particularly if you are doing a study where the subject matter may be heavy or may trigger an emotional response in participants, you'll want to talk about that and anything that you're going to do to mitigate any of those potential risks to participants. So for example, if you're studying a vulnerable population, maybe individuals experiencing homelessness, or maybe you are talking about a subject that can be traumatic, one way that you can mitigate some of that risk or harm to participants is by providing them with resources at the end of your study. So maybe a hotline or a phone number or any type of resources that may be able to help them cope with anything that emerged from describing their experiences or participating in an interview about that subject matter. And then you'll also want to talk about the treatment of your data. So typically you will want to make sure that you are maintaining the participants' anonymity and also their confidentiality. So you do not want to have their first and last name attached to their interview. You may use pseudonyms, or you might use ID numbers to identify them throughout the study. And then in terms of securing your data, you will want to make sure that it's secure, essentially. So here you'll describe, are you using a password protected file to save the data? Are you locking it up in a file cabinet? Who has access to the data? And also, what do you intend to do with it once the study's been concluded? So typically researchers will destroy the data after 5 years. So that might be the method that you take in terms of getting rid of the data once you have completed your study. And then the next section is going to be the summary. So just like every chapter in the dissertation, you will conclude with a summary. Here, you'll just think about if my reader read none of my chapter, which hopefully that's not the case for you, and they only have time to read the study, what are the high points that I want them to take away? Now, in doing that, you still want to touch on each element. You just might not go as in depth. So you'll definitely want to let them know about the problem, the purpose, and the research questions, the type of method that you're using, so qualitative, the type of design that you're using, and then probably a brief overview of the actual data collection method. So you won't go so in depth about where you're recruiting, but you will still want to talk about your sampling strategy, the sample that you intend to collect, and also the qualitative interview or the type of data that you intend on collecting. And then you'll finish off your summary by transitioning into the next chapter. So you may say something like, the results of the data collection will be discussed in the following chapter, just to kind of move things along. But that is the end of the content portion of this webinar. Again, we do provide dissertation editing and consulting. We do also provide free consultations. So if after this presentation you feel like you just need to talk to somebody about your research, or you have more questions related to your particular study, do reach out for that free 30-minute consultation, and we can help identify some areas. It is a very a la carte service, so we can kind of help out and see where you need the most support. But I will open it up for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we will go through those.